The fence was cut clean, not chewed by animals, not snapped by wind or rotted by rain. Cut. Three strands of barbed wire sliced through with something sharp and deliberate, the ends curling back from the posts like fingers prying open a wound. Josiah Crawford knelt beside the damage in the gray light before dawn, his knees popping, as they always did, now that he had passed 50, and he ran one calloused thumb along the severed edge. His son Emmett stood behind him, 17 years old, and still carrying the gangly uncertainty of a body that had not yet caught up with its ambition. "That is the third time in 2 months," Josiah said quietly. Emmett shifted his weight. "Bears again. Bears do not carry wire cutters." Josiah rose slowly, his gaze sweeping the tree line where the dark pines met the first pale suggestion of morning. 3 calves had slipped through the way overnight. They would need to be found before something else found them first. "Go tell Silas. I will track the calves before the trail goes cold." Emmett mounted his horse and rode hard toward the north pasture where his employer, his surrogate brother, the man who had essentially raised him since boyhood, was already driving fence posts into the rocky Colorado earth with the kind of controlled fury that passed in Silas Callahan for a normal Tuesday morning. Silas stood 6'8" in his boots, broad across the shoulders as a barn door, hands scarred from 15 years of rope and wire and the sharp edges of a life built by force of will on the side of a mountain. He swung the post maul in a steady rhythm, each impact driving the timber deeper, each stroke carrying the quiet rage of a man who had buried his father 5 years ago and sworn on the grave that not 1 acre of this land would ever belong to anyone else. He heard Emmett coming before he saw him, paused, wiped sweat from his brow with a forearm streaked with dirt and old scars, listened to the boy's breathless report, said nothing for a long moment. Then, with the economy of language that defined him, Pemberton. It was not a question. 2 miles south in the barn behind the main house, his youngest brother Beckett sat on the top rail of the corral fence, speaking softly to a half-wild filly that no one else could touch. Beckett was 27, built like his brothers, tall and strong, but carrying it differently, as if the same raw material had been shaped by gentler hands. He had their mother's eyes, people said, the same quiet warmth, the same way of seeing things that others missed. In his lap sat an open sketchbook. The page held a half-finished drawing of the mountains at first light, rendered in graphite with a precision and emotion that would have earned respect in any Eastern gallery, though Beckett would never have believed it if someone told him so. The filly stepped closer, breathed against his knee. He did not move, did not reach, just waited patient as the mountains themselves until the animal decided on her own terms that this particular human could be trusted. This was his gift, not the drawing, though, that was real enough. His gift was patience. His gift was the willingness to let frightened things come to him in their own time. He would need that gift in the days ahead, though he did not know it yet. The last of the 3 Callahan brothers was not on the ranch at all that morning. Colton, 30 years old and the middle child in every sense of the word, had ridden into Ridgerest before sunrise to collect supplies from Dawson's Mercantile. Colton was the face the Callahan operation showed to the world. He had the easy smile, the firm handshake, the ability to read a room and say exactly what needed saying to keep the wheels of commerce turning. He could talk a nervous seller down by 10% and make the man feel grateful for the discount. But today the smile had a hard edge to it. In his coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had become permanent, was the second notice from the bank. The loan their father had taken 2 years before his death, $500 for breeding stock, was coming due. The payments were current. The terms were clear. But the tone of the letter suggested that clarity and currency might not be enough. Not when Cornelius Pemberton sat on the bank's board of directors. Not when Pemberton had been circling Callahan water rights like a vulture over a dying steer for the better part of a decade. Colton did not mention the letter to his brothers. Not yet. Some problems needed to be understood before they could be shared, and Colton understood this one better than he wished. That evening, the 4 men gathered around the kitchen table in the main house. Josiah and Emmett at the smaller table by the wall, observing the fiction that they were employees rather than family, though 15 years of shared labor and loyalty had long ago erased whatever that distinction was supposed to mean. Josiah reported the cut fence. 3rd time in 2 months. Deliberate, professional. Someone wanted the Callahan herd thin their fences, weaken their operation, undermine one small wound at a time. Henderson sold last spring, Beckett observed quietly. The name landed on the table like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone knew what it meant. The Henderson family had held the ranch to the east for 12 years. Good people, hard workers. They had resisted Cornelius Pemberton's offers for as long as they could until a series of unexplained setbacks, sick, cattle-damaged equipment, a barn fire that the sheriff called accidental, despite evidence to the contrary, had worn them down to nothing. "We are not the Hendersons," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "This land was our father's dream. He spent his life building it. I will die before I sell a single acre." No one at the table doubted him, but Silas carried a weight the others could not see. The bank notice Colton had not yet shared. The cut fences that spoke of an enemy with patience and resources. And another burden older and heavier locked behind the granite expression he wore like armor, the knowledge that 7 years ago, in a moment of violence that still visited him in dreams, he had killed a man named Garrett Fowler. Self-defense. The sheriff had confirmed it. Fowler had been terrorizing the Henderson family long before their recent troubles, burning out buildings, poisoning wells, threatening children. Silas had tried to resolve it with words. Fowler had answered with a drawn pistol, and Silas, faster and steadier in that terrible fraction of a second, had answered with a bullet. He had told no one. Not his brothers, not Josiah, not the God he sometimes prayed to in the small hours when the nightmares came. Because Garrett Fowler had a brother, Nathaniel. And Nathaniel Fowler, wherever he was in the vast, indifferent West, had sworn to settle the debt in blood. Silas kept this secret for the same reason he did everything to protect the people he loved. It was the noblest and most dangerous instinct he possessed. There was also the matter of the advertisement. He had placed it 6 weeks ago in the Denver papers and the Boston Herald, written in his own careful hand. "Respectable ranch in Colorado Territory seeks educated woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to work hard and embrace frontier life. Fair treatment and comfortable home guaranteed. Write to S. Callahan, Ridgerest, Colorado Territory." It was not a romantic gesture, it was mathematics. 3 men and 1 aging foreman working 16 hours a day in the fields left no one to manage the household. The accounts, the supply chain, the 100 small but critical tasks that kept a ranch operation from slowly drowning in its own inefficiency. And there was the social calculus. A homestead without a woman at its center carried a certain stigma in frontier society. Banks were less inclined to extend credit. Neighbors were less inclined to cooperate. The world Silas had learned expected certain things of a household, and meeting those expectations was not capitulation. It was strategy. 4 women had responded to his advertisement. 4 women had stopped writing when they learned that the household included not 1 man, but 3 brothers living under the same roof. The 5th woman had not stopped writing. She had asked practical questions about the ranch, the climate, the nearest town, the availability of books. She had described herself as educated, healthy, and willing to work. She had mentioned the recent death of her father and the necessity of starting a new life. She had not asked about love, which Silas appreciated because he did not know what he would have said. Her name was Eliza Whitmore. She was 22 years old. She was arriving on Thursday. And Silas Callahan, who could face down a stampede without flinching, who had killed a man and carried the weight of it for 7 years without breaking, found himself unable to sleep the night before her arrival for reasons he could not have articulated if his life depended on it. The stagecoach rounded the last bend into Ridgerest on a Thursday afternoon in July of 1878, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the hot, still air like a signal fire. The town itself was modest, a single main street flanked by wooden buildings that clung to the mountainside with the stubborn determination of everything that survived in this country. Dawson's Mercantile, the Ridgerest Savings and Loan, a church with a white steeple, a saloon, a livery stable, perhaps 24 houses scattered along the slopes like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Eliza Whitmore descended from the coach with the careful dignity of a woman who had been traveling for 11 days and refused to let it show. Her navy blue dress was dusty despite her best efforts. Her honey blonde hair, pinned in a modest style that her mother had taught her, had begun to escape its arrangement in soft tendrils around her temples. She was small, 5'3", slender and fine-boned in a way that made her look fragile, though she was not. She carried a worn leather satchel containing everything of value she possessed in the world, her mother's cameo brooch pinned at her throat, a small purse with $12.30, a letter of introduction from the marriage broker in Denver, and hidden in a secret pocket sewn into the lining with her own hands, a letter from a man named Edmund Graves that she had read so many times the paper was wearing thin at the folds. The letter was a threat. Graves claimed that her father had owed him $2,000 secured by a promissory note that he was prepared to enforce. Eliza believed the note was forged. She believed that Graves, her father's former business partner, had systematically looted their company and driven her father to financial ruin, and that the debt was a fabrication designed to squeeze the last drops of value from a dead man's estate. But believing and proving were different things. Graves was wealthy and connected. Eliza was alone, penniless, and 2,000 miles from any court that might hear her case. She had answered the advertisement from Colorado not only because she needed a home and a future, but because she needed to disappear. Standing in the dusty main street of Ridgerest, clutching her satchel with white-knuckled hands, she felt the enormity of what she had done settle over her like a physical weight. She was about to marry a stranger. She was about to live in a place where she knew no one, where the rules of Boston society meant nothing, where survival depended on skills she did not possess. Her mother's voice preserved in memory with the clarity of a bell. Whitmore women do not break Eliza. We bend and then we straighten. She straightened. Mrs. Abigail Hargrove noticed her first. The mayor's sister stood on the porch of the general store with two other women, and her eyes cataloged every detail of the new arrival with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had made other people's business her life's work. Then came the sound of hooves. 3 riders appeared at the far end of the street, moving in a loose formation that spoke of years riding together, and even at a distance they were impossible to miss. 3 tall men on powerful horses, broad-shouldered, chestnut-haired, carrying themselves with the easy confidence of people who owned the ground beneath them. As they drew closer, Eliza felt her breath catch. They shared the same strong jaw, the same amber eyes, the same weathered handsomeness. Brothers, unmistakably. And all 3 of them were looking at her. Silas reached her first. He dismounted with the fluid economy of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it, and he removed his hat to reveal a face that was striking in its severity. Sharp planes controlled intensity, a thin scar along the jawline, eyes the color of whiskey held to the light. Miss Whitmore? Yes. She was proud of how steady her voice sounded. Mr. Callahan. Silas Callahan. He gestured to the men dismounting behind him. These are my brothers, Colton and Beckett. Colton tipped his hat with an easy grin that looked like it had gotten him out of trouble more times than it had gotten him into it. Beckett held his hat in his hand, his expression open and curious, and unexpectedly gentle for a man his size. A beat of silence. Eliza's eyes moved from face to face. The same face repeated 3 times with subtle variations like a theme in music transposed to different keys. The advertisement had said brothers. It had not said 3. The advertisement mentioned brothers, she said carefully. It did not mention that I would be meeting 3 potential husbands. The gasp from Mrs. Hargrove's porch was audible across the street. 3 one woman and 3 men under one roof. It is indecent. Silas's jaw tightened, but it was Eliza's reaction that surprised everyone, including herself. She did not flinch. She did not blush. She simply filed the information away, the way her father had taught her to file unexpected entries in a ledger calmly and with attention to what they revealed. The arrangement is perfectly respectable, Silas said, his voice carrying the particular tension of a man who has rehearsed this explanation and hates that it is necessary. Miss Whitmore will be my wife. My brothers live on the ranch as family. Then why, Eliza asked, did you not say so plainly in your letters? The question hit home. Colton shifted his weight. Beckett looked at his boots. Silas met her gaze directly, and for the first time Eliza saw something behind the granite exterior. Something that might have been shame quickly mastered and put away. Because the last 4 women I wrote to stopped responding when they learned the full arrangement. You mean you calculated that deception was preferable to honesty? The words carried the precise, unhurried authority of a woman who had been educated by a school teacher, mother, and trained in logic by a bookkeeper father. They landed in the silence like stones dropped from a height. Several onlookers winced. Colton opened his mouth to deploy his charm, but Beckett spoke first. "What we need," the youngest brother said softly, "is for Miss Whitmore to feel welcome, not ambushed. We owe her an apology, not an explanation." Eliza looked at him, really looked, and saw something she recognized: sincerity without calculation. Honesty offered freely without expectation of return. It was the rarest quality she had encountered in a man, and it cut through her rising panic like a lamp in fog. She took a breath. "I have traveled 2,000 miles. I have spent my last money. I have nowhere to return to." She paused, aware that she had revealed more than she intended, then pressed forward. "So I will come to your ranch, and I will listen to what you have to say. But I make no promises, and I will not be deceived again." Silas nodded once. He reached for her trunk, lifting it as if it weighed nothing, and secured it behind his saddle. Then he offered her his hand. It was the first time she had ever been helped onto a horse by a man whose palm could have enclosed both of hers, with room to spare. She was intensely aware of the strength in his grip, the controlled gentleness of it, and the warmth that radiated from his body as she settled awkwardly in front of him on the saddle. Behind them, Ridgerest hummed with scandal. Mrs. Hargrove was already composing the first of what would be many sermons on the subject. Eliza did not look back. The ride to the ranch took just over an hour. The trail climbed steadily through pine forests that smelled of resin and earth, opening periodically into meadows brilliant with wildflowers. The air cooled as they ascended, sweet and thin, in a way that made Eliza's Boston lungs work harder, and the landscape unfolded around her with a grandeur so vast and indifferent that she felt simultaneously insignificant and alive in a way she had never experienced. The ranch, when it appeared, exceeded every expectation she had formed. Not the rough cabin of her imagination, but a substantial two-story house built of heavy timber with a wide covered porch, stone chimneys, and glass windows. Surrounding it, a large barn, corrals, outbuildings, fenced pastures stretching toward the tree line. And above everything, the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, snow-capped even in July, a backdrop of impossible beauty. "Your father built this?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Our father started it. We finished it," Silas replied. "Took 15 years and every dollar we had." Something in the simplicity of that statement, the quiet pride beneath it, the weight of years and labor compressed into a single sentence, told Eliza more about Silas Callahan than his letters ever had. Josiah Crawford emerged from the barn as they rode up. He was 56 years old, with a face like a topographic map and eyes that recorded everything and revealed nothing. Beside him, Emmett stared at Eliza with the frank astonishment of a boy who had rarely seen a woman under the age of 40. "Ma'am," Josiah said, touching his hat. The single syllable conveyed acknowledgement, assessment, and reserve in equal measure. Inside the house confirmed what Eliza had already guessed from its inhabitants: solid, clean, and almost entirely devoid of feminine influence. Heavy handmade furniture, mounted antlers on the walls, a single landscape painting that she would later learn was Beckett's work, a well-equipped kitchen lacking the organized warmth of a woman's management, and books, more than she had expected. A full shelf beside the fireplace, ranging from agricultural manuals to poetry. The sight eased something tight in her chest. These were not unlettered men. Silas showed her to a room on the upper floor, small but private, a brass bed with clean quilts, a washstand, a window overlooking the valley, wildflowers in a jar on the sill. "This was our mother's sewing room," he said. The sentence opened a door into the family's history that all his careful letters had kept firmly shut. "We cleared it for you." "It is lovely," Eliza said, and meant it. Someone had taken care with this room. Someone had thought about what a woman might need and had tried within the limits of masculine understanding to provide it. That someone, she would learn later, was Beckett. Dinner that first evening was an exercise in barely concealed tension. Eliza insisted on helping to cook, partly to be useful, and partly because her hands needed occupation to keep them from trembling. She discovered that Colton was the best cook among the brothers, having learned on cattle drives. Beckett was adequate. Silas, by all evidence, subsisted on coffee and dried meat when left to his own devices. They gathered around the table, Silas at the head, eating with methodical efficiency, speaking rarely. When he did speak, his brothers listened. The weight of authority sat on him as naturally as his hat. Colton filled the silences with easy conversation, asking about Boston, her journey, her impressions of the territory. His charm was genuine, but Eliza noticed it served double duty. He was gathering intelligence while putting her at ease. Behind his smile, sharp eyes were taking her a measure. Beckett was the quietest but the most attentive. He noticed when her coffee cup was nearly empty and refilled it before she could ask. He caught the moment her expression tightened when Colton inquired about her family and smoothly redirected the conversation to the ranch's horses. Josiah ate at the smaller table with Emmett maintaining a polite distance, though his occasional glances at Silas communicated volumes. After the meal, Silas laid out the terms with the directness that Eliza was beginning to understand was not rudeness but simply the way he was built. This ranch needs a woman, not as decoration, as a partner. There is bookkeeping to manage a household, to run supplies, to organize, and 100 tasks that fall through the cracks because all of us are working cattle from dawn to dark. He paused, looking into his coffee. A ranch without a woman at its center is just a business. I want it to be a home. The honesty in the admission surprised everyone, including Silas. Colton's eyebrows rose. Beckett hid a small smile behind his cup. "And the marriage?" Eliza asked. "When you are ready." "If you are ready, I will not force you. Stay as long as you need to decide. If you choose to leave, I will pay your fare east." "I have no east to return to," Eliza said softly. Then, realizing she had opened a door she was not yet ready to walk through, she straightened. "But I appreciate the offer and I accept your terms. I will stay. I will work and I will decide the rest when I have had time to know you all." Later, when Eliza had retired to her room, the three brothers sat together around the dying fire in a silence that held the particular weight of men who have shared everything since childhood and are now confronting something none of them know how to navigate. Colton was the first to speak. "Well, brother, you certainly know how to pick them all, fire them." Silas said nothing. "I mean that as a compliment. She is not what I expected. I expected meek. I expected grateful. I expected someone who would fold into the background and make biscuits." He paused. "She is going to be a problem." "She is not a problem," Beckett said quietly. "She is exactly what this house needs." "That is what I mean." Colton's voice held something complicated, something he was not yet ready to examine. He stood stretched and headed for the stairs with a casualness that did not quite conceal the way his eyes lingered on the closed door at the top of the landing. "Good night, brothers. Try not to terrify her before breakfast." After he left, Beckett looked at Silas with an expression that carried far more perception than his 27 years should have allowed. "He likes her," the youngest brother said simply. "Everyone likes her." Silas replied, his voice perfectly neutral. "That is not what I mean, and you know it." Silas drained his coffee, set down the cup. "Go to bed, Beck." Beckett went. But as he climbed the stairs, he carried with him the image of his eldest brother's face in the firelight, and the knowledge, clear as a mountain stream, that Silas Callahan was already falling for a woman he had invited into his home as a practical arrangement, and that the falling terrified him more than any stampede or gunfight or frozen mountain pass ever had. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Josiah found Silas on the porch with a glass of whiskey he rarely touched. The older man sat down on the step without invitation, because 15 years of loyalty had earned him the right to sit wherever he pleased. "She is stronger than she looks," Josiah observed. Silas did not look up. "I know. Smarter, too. Caught an error in the feed calculations that both you and I missed." Silence. "But she is frightened of something. Not the ranch, not the work. Something she brought with her." Silas's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, then resumed their grip on the glass. "I noticed. Going to ask her about it. When she is ready to tell me." Josiah nodded slowly. This was the man he had helped raise, patient, observant, respectful of boundaries that others might have trampled. Then the older man spoke again, his voice dropping to a register that Silas had learned to associate with the rarest and most important things Josiah ever said. "You are your father's son, Silas. He could not tell your mother that he loved her until the day she was dying. Do not repeat his mistake." The words landed like a blow. Silas stared into the amber liquid in his glass, his jaw working, saying nothing. But his hands trembled, and Josiah saw it, and that was enough. The old man rose, squeezed Silas's shoulder once, and disappeared into the darkness. Silas remained on the porch for a long time after that, listening to the mountain wind in the pines and the distant low of cattle and thinking about his father, about the words the old man had been unable to say, and about the small, fierce, terrified woman sleeping in his mother's sewing room, and what any of it might mean for a future he had never allowed himself to want. In the 2 weeks that followed, Eliza Whitmore transformed the Callahan household with the quiet, relentless efficiency of water reshaping stone. She reorganized the kitchen. She took over the bookkeeping and discovered that Silas's ledger system was logical but inefficient, correcting it without fanfare or condescension. She cataloged every supply, every tool, every piece of equipment on the ranch, creating an inventory so thorough that Colton, examining it, whistled softly and said to Beckett, "We are never letting her leave this family." Beckett, watching Eliza from across the room, smiled and said nothing. Silas observed her the way he observed everything, carefully, constantly, and with a control so practiced it appeared effortless. He assigned her tasks, accepted her work without excessive praise, maintained a physical distance so careful it bordered on architectural. And yet Eliza noticed things. The coffee. Every morning it appeared exactly the way she drank it, 2 sugars before she reached the kitchen. She had mentioned her preference once. He had remembered the porch step. She had stumbled on a loose board her 3rd day at the ranch. The next morning it was repaired. No one mentioned it. No one took credit. The blanket. When the mountain nights grew cold enough to wake her shivering, a heavier quilt appeared on her bed. She did not see who placed it there. She did not need to. These were the ways Silas Callahan said the things he could not bring himself to say with words. Each silent gesture carried more eloquence than a sonnet, and each one chipped away at the walls Eliza had built around her heart with the slow, steady persistence of a man who knew how to drive fence posts into rocky ground. It was Beckett who taught her to ride. He selected a gentle chestnut mare named Penny, small enough for Eliza's stature but trail-wise and steady. Their lessons took place in the meadow behind the house, away from the others, which Eliza appreciated. Learning to ride was difficult enough without an audience. "Penny is like a conversation," Beckett explained, as Eliza gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination. "She is talking to you with every movement. Your job is to listen." "At the moment," Eliza replied through gritted teeth, "she seems to be saying she finds me ridiculous." Beckett laughed. It was the first time Eliza had heard him laugh, and the sound was warm and unguarded in a way that made her like him immediately. "She is saying you are gripping too hard. Loosen your hands. Trust her." Trust. The word followed her everywhere on this ranch, threading through every interaction, every decision, every moment of vulnerability. Trust the horse, trust the brothers, trust the land, trust herself. It was during one of these rides, accompanying Silas alone to check the north fence line, that Eliza experienced the moment that changed something fundamental within her. They crested a ridge and the entire valley opened before them, miles of meadow and forest rolling toward peaks that seemed to touch the sky. The scale of it, the raw, untouched grandeur, stopped her breath. "Oh," she whispered. Silas, who had seen this view 1,000 times, watched her face instead of the landscape. The wonder in her expression, the way her eyes filled with a brightness that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with discovery, made something in his chest ache with an intensity he had not felt since the day they lowered his mother into the ground. "This is what we are fighting for," she said softly. "Not the money, not the pride, this." "Yet," Silas replied. And the single word spoken in his low, rough voice against the vast silence of the mountains was the most intimate thing he had ever said to another human being. The church confrontation came on the second Sunday. Silas had insisted they attend services in Ridgerest, a calculated attempt to establish the household's respectability. He had scrubbed his boots, pressed his shirt, and endured the indignity of a formal collar with the stoic suffering of a man submitting to torture for a greater cause. Colton looked effortlessly presentable as always. Beckett wore his best clothes with an air of quiet apology. And Eliza, in her one good dress, walked into the church of Ridgerest on Silas Callahan's arm like a woman entering battle. The reception was arctic. Pews near the Callahans emptied as families shuffled elsewhere. Whispered commentary from Mrs. Hargrove provided a running soundtrack of disapproval that was clearly intended to be overheard. When the service ended, the confrontation that had been building for 2 weeks finally arrived. Mrs. Hargrove approached on the church steps, flanked by her allies, radiating righteous certainty. "Miss Whitmore, Or should I say the future Mrs. Callahan, whichever brother she selects? The smile was a blade wrapped in silk. I feel obligated to inform you that decent women in Ridgerest have standards. Whatever arrangement you have with those three men, it is not the kind of household we wish to see in our community. Eliza felt the heat rise in her face, not embarrassment, something older and fiercer. The righteous fire her mother had called it on the rare occasions when Elizabeth Whitmore had allowed herself to burn. Silas stepped forward. His massive frame cast a shadow over Mrs. Hargrove that made the older woman take an involuntary step backward. But Eliza placed her hand on his arm the first time she had voluntarily touched him, and the contact stopped him as effectively as a wall. "Mrs. Hargrove," Eliza said, and her voice carried the clear, unhurried precision of a woman who had been raised to use words the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. "I am living under the protection and roof of three honest, hard-working men who have treated me with nothing but respect. I cook their meals. I keep their books. I sleep in my own room behind a locked door. I fail to see how any of that offends your standards." She paused. "Though I suspect your concern is less about standards and more about having someone new to disapprove of." The silence that followed is electric, Mrs. Bung. Hargrove's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. Colton bit the inside of his cheek to keep from grinning. Beckett's eyes widened with undisguised admiration. And Silas. Silas Callahan looked at Eliza Whitmore with an expression that she could not decipher, but that made her heart miss its footing. It was not admiration exactly, though admiration was part of it. It was something larger and more dangerous. It was the look of a man who has just realized that the ground he thought was solid has shifted beneath him, and that he is falling, and that he does not want to stop. They rode home in unusual silence. Finally, Colton spoke. "Well, if they did not know what to make of you before, they certainly do not now." "Was I too harsh?" A thread of doubt in Eliza's voice. "You were magnificent," Beckett said softly from behind them. Silas said nothing, but his hand resting on the saddle horn inches from where Eliza sat tightened until the leather creaked. In the days that followed the church confrontation, something shifted in Ridgerest's perception of Eliza Whitmore. The disapproval did not vanish. Mrs. Hargrove and her circle continued their campaign of cold shoulders and pointed whispers. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared in the wall of unified judgment. Adelaide Fletcher, the doctor's wife, stopped Eliza outside the general store and invited her for tea. It was the first social invitation Eliza had received since arriving in Colorado Territory, and it meant more than the older woman could have known. Adelaide was a practical woman who had married a frontier doctor against her Philadelphia family's wishes and understood what it meant to build a life in defiance of other people's expectations. Over teacups in the Fletcher parlor, she offered Eliza something more valuable than friendship intelligence. "Pemberton is pressuring the bank board," Adelaide said, her voice low and matter-of-fact. "He has been doing it for months, not just against you, against several families. He wants to own this entire valley, Eliza. Water rights, grazing, land, timber. All of it." "How do you know this?" "Because my husband treats the banker's ulcers and Vernon Whitfield talks more than he should when he is in pain." The information deepened Eliza's understanding of the threat. This was not personal. The Callahans were not being targeted because of her or because of the unconventional household. They were merely the latest obstacle in a systematic campaign of acquisition. And systematic campaigns, Eliza knew from watching her father fight Edmund Graves, were fought with ledgers and documents, not fists and fury. She filed the information away. She would need it sooner than she expected. Meanwhile, on the ranch, Colton was discovering something uncomfortable about himself. It happened on a rainy afternoon, trapped inside, when Eliza asked to review the ranch's complete financial records. They worked side by side at the kitchen table for hours, shoulders occasionally touching, and Colton found himself watching her with an attention that had nothing to do with the numbers on the page. The small, satisfied sound she made when columns balanced. The way she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The fierce intelligence in those blue eyes directed at problems she had no obligation to solve, but attacked anyway with her whole heart. He excused himself abruptly, stood in the barn listening to rain on the roof, and confronted a truth he had been avoiding. He was developing feelings for a woman who was developing feelings for his brother. And no amount of charm in the world could make that not hurt. He said nothing about it. He would not. Because Colton Callahan was many things, but a man who put his own heart ahead of his brother's was not one of them. Not yet. Not ever if he had anything to say about it. The financial blow fell 1 week later. Silas returned from town with a face like granite and a letter from the bank. He gathered everyone around the kitchen table, and for the first time, Eliza saw something she had not seen before in this house: fear. Not on Silas's face, which remained controlled, but in Colton's eyes, which had lost every trace of their usual humor. In Beckett's hands, which gripped his coffee cup as if anchoring himself to something solid. In Josiah's stillness, which had the quality of a man bracing for an impact he cannot avoid. The bank's regional office, acting on the recommendation of the local board, which included Mayor Cornelius Pemberton, had reclassified the Callahan loan as high risk. The full balance of $500 was due within 6 weeks, not the 2 years remaining on the original schedule. 6 weeks. 500 Pollard, and Colton repeated. The charm was gone. What remained was the sharp, clear thinking of a man who understood money the way his brother understood cattle. In 6 weeks, that is impossible. Pemberton, Silas said flatly. He has been after our water rights for years. This is his move. Eliza listened. She had spent 2 weeks immersing herself in the ranch's financial records, learning every number, every margin, every vulnerability. She understood the situation with the mathematical clarity her father had spent years cultivating in her mind. The ranch is profitable, she said. Your cattle are excellent stock. In a fair market, you would have no difficulty meeting even an accelerated timeline. The fall auction is 12 weeks away, Beckett pointed out. Selling locally now would mean half price at best. Silence. Outside the window, the evening light painted the mountains gold, and the land that 4 generations of Callahans had fought to build and hold seemed to tremble on the edge of an abyss. Eliza pulled the ranch ledger toward her. Her expression shifted from sympathetic observer to engaged strategist, and every man at the table noticed the change. There is another option. The cattle markets in Cheyenne are offering premium prices this summer. If you could get the herd to the railhead there. That is a 200-mile drive, Josiah said from the doorway. Needs a crew of 6 at minimum. We have 6, Eliza replied. The brothers looked at her blankly. Silas, Colton, Beckett, Josiah, Emmett, and me. She met their stares with a calm that surprised even herself. I may not know how to rope a steer, but I can manage the supplies, keep the books to organize the logistics, and negotiate the sale when we get there. Silas studied her for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied in the gathering dark, and the evening wind stirred the pines with a sound like breathing. It is dangerous, he said, 200 miles through open country, weather thieves, stampedes. More dangerous than losing the ranch, she answered. And there it was, the quality that had drawn him to her letters months before he ever saw her face. The practical courage beneath the proper exterior. The refusal to accept defeat when alternatives existed, however desperate those alternatives might be. Silas looked at Josiah. The old man met his gaze and gave a single nod, the kind of nod that carried the weight of 15 years of trust and the unspoken message, she is right and you know it. We leave in 3 days, Silas said. And just like that, the kitchen table became a war room. Maps were produced, routes debated, supplies calculated, risks assessed with the cold precision of people who understood that failure meant losing everything they had ever loved. Eliza worked alongside the brothers until long past midnight, her handwriting filling page after page with supply lists, route calculations, contingency plans. She was in her element now, the daughter of a bookkeeper applying her father's gift for order and precision to the most important project of her life. And as the lamp burned low and the others gradually retired to their beds, she became aware that Silas had not moved from his chair across the table. He was watching her, not with the careful concealment of previous weeks, but openly as if the crisis had stripped away his last pretense of indifference. You do not have to do this, he said quietly. She looked up from her figures. Yes, I do. Why, this is not your fight. This is not your land. You could walk away. I could, she agreed, but I will not. She set down her pen and met his gaze with the steadiness that was becoming the defining feature of her character. Because this land is worth fighting for, because your family is worth fighting for, and because somewhere in the past 2 weeks this stopped being your ranch and started being my home. The word hung between them. Home. She had not meant to say it, but having said it, she did not take it back. Silas was quiet for a very long time. Then he rose, gathered the maps, and said, "Get some rest. We have a lot of work ahead." He paused at the kitchen door. Without turning around, in a voice so low she almost missed it, "Thank you, Eliza." It was the first time he had used her given name. She sat alone in the lamplight for several minutes after he left her, heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar, and she thought about her mother's words. Whitmore women do not break. We bend, and then we straighten. Eliza Whitmore had bent as far as she intended to bend. Now it was time to straighten. And God help anyone, banker or mayor or ghost from Boston, who tried to break her. 3 days. 3 days to prepare for a 200-mile cattle drive that would determine the fate of everything the Callahan brothers had built, everything their father had dreamed, and everything Eliza had come 2,000 miles to find. 3 days. And then the mountains. They left before the stars had faded. The morning of departure carried a silence that Eliza would remember for the rest of her life. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of weight. The kind that settles over a house when everyone in it understands that the next time they see this place, everything will have been decided one way or another. She stood on the porch in the last blue dark before dawn, wearing clothes Colton had assembled for her from the smallest sizes available at Dawson's Mercantile. A split riding skirt, a cotton shirt, sturdy boots that were still half a size too large. Her navy traveling dress hung in the wardrobe upstairs, and with it, she felt she had hung some earlier version of herself, the Boston version, the version that belonged to drawing rooms and ledger books, and the muffled grief of a city that had taken everything from her. The woman standing on this porch was someone different. She was not yet sure who. In the yard below, the brothers moved with the practiced choreography of men who had done this work since boyhood. Silas checked the cinches on the saddles with hands that could have crushed a man's wrist, but handled leather and buckle with the delicacy of a watchmaker. Colton loaded the supply wagon Eliza had packed with 14 days of provisions, each item selected and weighed and recorded in her precise handwriting. Beckett worked the horse string, moving among the animals with the quiet assurance of someone who spoke their language. Josiah emerged from the barn leading his horse Emmett close behind with two more. The old man moved with the stiff determination of a body that protested its duties every morning and was overruled every morning by a will that did not recognize the concept of complaint. Silas crossed the yard toward the porch. In the gray light without his hat, he looked younger than his 33 years and also older. As if the man and the boy existed simultaneously, layered one over the other like the rings of a tree. "Ready, Barry?" he asked, as I will ever be. He studied her face for a moment. Whatever he found there, it satisfied him. He nodded once and turned back to his horse. The herd moved out as the first gold touched the eastern peaks. 120 head of cattle, the accumulated wealth and hope and future of the Callahan name, driven north toward Cheyenne by three brothers, one old cowboy, one 17-year-old boy, and one 22-year-old woman from Boston who had never sat a horse 6 weeks ago. It was by any reasonable measure an act of desperation. Eliza preferred to think of it as an act of faith. The first 2 days established a rhythm that would carry them through the miles ahead. Silas and Josiah rode point, reading the land with the accumulated knowledge of decades spent in this country. Colton and Beckett worked the flanks, keeping the herd tight and moving. Emmett handled the remuda, the string of spare horses that rotated into service as the working animals tired. And Eliza drove the supply wagon, learning quickly that the difference between a Boston carriage and a frontier freight wagon was roughly equivalent to the difference between a waltz and a fistfight. Every rut jarred her spine. Every steep descent made her grip the seat until her knuckles went white. The dust raised by 120 cattle coated everything, her clothes, her skin, her teeth, in a fine, gritty layer that tasted of the earth itself. By the end of the first day, her arms ached from controlling the team. Her back was a continuous protest, and she had developed a profound and permanent respect for every teamster who had ever hauled freight across this country. She did not complain. Not once. She had decided somewhere in the preparation days that she would earn her place on this drive the only way it could be earned, by doing the work and bearing the cost without asking for accommodation. If the men could endure it, she could endure it. And if she broke, she would break quietly and fix herself when no one was looking. The brothers noticed. Silas said nothing, but Eliza caught him watching her that first evening as she climbed down from the wagon seat with legs that trembled, and the expression on his face was not pity. It was respect, the kind that is not given freely but extracted day by day through proof. The river came on the third day. Swollen with mountain snowmelt, it ran faster and deeper than Beckett's map had suggested. The cattle balked at the water's edge, milling and lowing their instinct for self-preservation, overriding the pressure from the riders behind them. Even the experienced horses were skittish. Silas rode the crossing first to test it. Eliza watched from the bank as his horse entered the current, the water rising to the animal's chest, pulling and tugging at both horse and rider, with a force that seemed personal, malicious, as if the river resented being asked to let them pass. He reached the far side and raised his arm, passable but dangerous. What followed was 2 hours of controlled chaos. Josiah and Silas worked the far bank, receiving animals as they scrambled out of the water. Colton and Beckett pushed the reluctant herd into the current from the near side, shouting and whistling, and using every trick they had learned in a lifetime of moving stubborn cattle. Emmett handled the loose horses, and Eliza drove the supply wagon into the river. The water hit the wheels and climbed the axles and surged around her legs, soaking her skirt cold enough to steal the breath from her lungs. The team horses panicked, fighting the reins, and the wagon lurched sideways as the rear wheel caught on a submerged rock. For 3 terrible seconds, the current pushed against the stalled wagon with the flat, implacable force of a thing that does not care whether you live or die, and Eliza felt the vehicle begin to tilt. Beckett reached her first. He drove his horse into the river without hesitation, reaching the wagon in seconds, and leaned from his saddle to grab the lead horse's bridle. His gift, that uncanny ability to communicate with frightened animals through touch and voice, and some wordless frequency that only he could transmit, steadied the horse long enough for Eliza to free the wheel. Together, they brought the wagon across. On the far bank, Silas was waiting. He helped her down, and his hands on her shoulders were not steady. She was soaked, shaking her hair plastered to her face, and she could feel the cold working into her bones. But she was alive, and the supplies were intact, and that was what mattered. "You could have been killed," he said. His voice was rough with something she had not heard in it before. "I could also have let our supplies wash downstream. I preferred the alternative." His fingers tightened on her shoulders for a fraction of a second. Then he released her and turned away to count the cattle, and neither of them spoke of it again. But something had changed in the space between them. Some barrier thinned, some distance closed, and both of them knew it. On the 5th day, Beckett noticed the rider. He told Silas that evening quietly while the others were busy with the herd. A lone figure on a gray horse appearing on ridge lines and disappearing into tree lines, always just at the edge of visibility. Consistent, deliberate, following. Silas's reaction told Beckett everything he needed to know and nothing he wanted to hear. His eldest brother's face went blank, not the usual controlled composure, but a deeper, more deliberate emptiness. The face of a man slamming iron shutters over windows. "How long?" Silas asked. "Since yesterday at least, maybe longer." "Describe him." Beckett provided what details he could. Medium build, dark clothing, a gray horse. Silas said nothing more. But that night he took the first watch alone, sitting with his rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness with an intensity that Eliza, unable to sleep, observed from her bedroll. She knew fear when she saw it. She had worn it herself often enough. But Silas's fear had a specific quality directed not at the general dangers of the trail, but at something particular. Something with a name he was not sharing. She filed this away alongside everything else she was learning about Silas Callahan. The coffee, the porch step, the blanket, the rifle in the dark, each piece of the puzzle revealing a man who protected the people around him at any cost, including the cost of carrying his burdens alone. The 7th day brought fire. It started a mile to the east. A dry lightning strike from a storm that passed without rain, igniting the brittle prairie grass, with the casual indifference of a god who has forgotten what it means to be small and mortal, and standing in the path of something you cannot stop. The wind caught the flames and drove them toward the herd with a speed that turned possibility into certainty in the time it takes to draw a breath. The cattle smelled the smoke before the riders saw the flames. 120 animals, each one carrying the survival of the Callahan Ranch in its living weight, began to shift and low and press against each other with the rising panic of creatures who understand in their bones what fire means. Silas's voice cut through the growing chaos like a blade. Move them west, now. Every rider responded instantly, but the herd was already fracturing, fear overriding the weeks of training and the pressure of the flanking riders. The lead cattle broke into a run, and within seconds, the situation escalated from manageable to catastrophic. Eliza faced an impossible choice. The supply wagon sat directly in the path of the stampeding herd, too heavy to move quickly, too valuable to abandon. She made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She unhitched the team horses, slapped them free to save their lives, and climbed onto the wagon seat to steer using the momentum already carrying it. She heard Silas's roar through the thunder of hooves. She could not make out the words. It did not matter. She was committed. Colton retired her first riding alongside the lurching wagon at full gallop, and in a display of horsemanship and raw strength that Eliza would never fully believe. Even after watching it happen, he reached across and lifted her bodily from the seat onto his horse. The wagon overturned behind them, spilling crates across the prairie, but the critical supplies survived in their secured containers. The stampede was contained through the combined efforts of all the riders. Silas and Josiah turned the lead cattle in a wide arc, bending the stampede into a circle until the animals exhausted their panic. Beckett and Emmett recovered the scattered stragglers. When the dust settled, they counted the kidon. 8 head of cattle lost to the stampede. The wagon damaged but repairable. Colton nursing a bruised shoulder from the rescue, and Josiah Crawford on the ground. Silas saw him through the settling dust and felt something inside his chest collapse. The old man lay on his side in the trampled grass, his face gray with pain, his left leg bent at an angle that no leg should bend. His horse stood nearby sides, heaving its own flank scraped and bloody, where the stampeding cattle had struck it and sent it down, taking its rider with it. Emmett reached his father first. The boy's face was white. His hands shook as he knelt in the dirt, reaching for Josiah's arm, then pulling back, afraid that any touch might make it worse. "Do not look at the leg," Josiah said through clenched teeth. His voice was tight with pain, but steady with the discipline of a man who had survived worse than this and knew that panic was a luxury he could not afford. "Look at my eyes, son. I am going to be all right." But it was bad. The bone was broken cleanly, the sharp end visible through the torn fabric of his trouser leg. At 56 years old and open country days from the nearest doctor, a wound like this could kill. Not from the break itself, but from what came after. Infection, fever, the slow betrayal of a body pushed past its capacity to heal. Beckett set the bone and splinted it with wood and strips of cloth torn from a spare shirt, working with steady hands in the focused calm of a man who could not afford to acknowledge the horror of what he was doing. Eliza prepared what pain relief their medical kit could offer her, knowledge drawn from the books her mother had insisted she read, and the practical instinct of a woman who had nursed her father through his final illness. Silas stood apart watching. His face was a mask, but his hands hanging at his sides trembled with a violence he could not control. Josiah Crawford had been on this land before Silas was born. He was the last living connection to the father who had built it. He was the man who had told Silas not 12 days ago not to repeat his father's mistake. And now he lay broken on the ground and Silas could do nothing. "Stop standing there like a statue," Josiah said from the grass, his voice rough but undefeated. "Cattle still need driving. Ranch still needs saving. I broke my leg, not my will. Go." Silas looked at Eliza. She looked back. Her eyes were wet, but her chin was up, and in that moment, she looked less like a 22-year-old woman from Boston and more like something forged in the same fire that had made this country. "He is right," she said. "We keep going. I will take care of Josiah on the wagon. The rest of you handle the herd." The decision to continue with a critically injured man, a reduced crew, and a saboteur somewhere behind them was the hardest any of them had ever made. But the alternative was worse. Turning back meant losing the ranch. And losing the ranch meant that everything Josiah had given his body, for everything the elder Callahan had died building, everything these brothers had poured their lives into, would be handed to Cornelius Pemberton for pennies on the dollar. They pressed on. That night after camp was made and the herd settled, Beckett shared what he had found at the site where the fire began. A ring of stones, traces of kerosene, boot prints leading east. The fire was not a natural lightning strike. Someone had set it deliberately to cause the stampede. The revelation landed on the group like a physical weight. The mysterious rider, the cut fences back at the ranch, and now arson, attempted murder by proxy, disguised as an act of nature. Colton turned to Silas with eyes that held no trace of their usual warmth. "You know something. You know who is doing this." "I have suspicions," Silas said. He revealed only part of the truth, enough to acknowledge the danger without explaining its source. "Someone with a grudge against our family." "Against our family or against you?" Colton pressed. The question hung in the air. Silas did not answer. That night, while the camp slept fitfully, Emmett sat beside his father's makeshift bed in the wagon, holding the old man's hand. Josiah drifted in and out of consciousness, his face sheened with sweat, his breathing shallow. Silas came and sat beside the boy. They did not speak for a long time. Then Emmett asked the question that had been burning in him since the moment his father went down. "What if he does not make it?" Silas was quiet. He owed this boy the truth, or at least as much of it as a 17-year-old could bear. "Then you will become the man he has been teaching you to become." Silas said, his voice low and steady. "A father does not need to live forever. His lessons do." Emmett stared at him in the firelight, and something shifted in the boy's face. Not understanding, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. The first glimpse of the terrible, necessary truth that every boy must eventually learn, that the men who raise us do not stay, but the things they teach us never leave. From that night forward, Emmett Crawford was different. The boyish eagerness did not vanish, but it was joined by something harder and more permanent. He took his father's watch shifts without being asked. He helped Eliza change Josiah's bandages without flinching. He worked twice as hard and complained not at all, and when the other riders looked at him, they no longer saw a boy. On the 10th night, the wolves came. The attack was coordinated and savage, a pack of gray predators drawn by the scent of cattle in open country. They struck in the darkest hours, and the camp erupted from sleep into chaos. Rifles cracking in the night, cattle bellowing, the ghostly shapes of wolves moving at the edges of the firelight. In the confusion, several cattle broke away from the herd and scattered into the darkness. Eliza, who had been learning to ride for barely a month, did not hesitate. She seized a horse and went after them. It was not bravery in the traditional sense. It was mathematics. Each animal represented money they could not afford to lose. Each loss brought them closer to the threshold below which the drive became pointless and the ranch became Pemberton's. She recovered 3 steers, turning them back toward the herd with a combination of shouted commands and desperate maneuvering that owed more to determination than technique. On her way back, she encountered a lone wolf, a large gray male separated from the pack, standing between her and the camp. Her horse reared. Eliza, gripped with her knees the way Beckett had taught her, drew the small revolver that Colton had insisted she carry despite her initial protests, and fired into the air. The wolf disappeared into the darkness. She rode back into camp, breathless, disheveled, leading 3 recovered cattle. The brothers stared at her. Colton broke the silence. "The frontier has officially claimed you, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Callahan," she corrected without thinking, and then she froze. The word had come from somewhere she had not authorized it to come from somewhere beneath the careful, practical, self-sufficient surface she had maintained since the day she boarded a train in Boston with $12 and a forged debt hanging over her head. The silence that followed was not like the silence after the stampede, heavy and full of fear. This was lighter, charged with possibility rather than dread. And in it, Silas Callahan, standing in the firelight with his rifle still in his hands, looked at Eliza Whitmore with an expression that held no barriers, no granite, no careful distance. Just a man looking at a woman he had tried very hard not to love, discovering that the trying had failed. "Not yet," he said quietly, "but I would like it to be." It was the most words he had ever given to a feeling. It was not a proposal, not a declaration. It was a door held open, an invitation, not a demand. And it honored them both, his need for restraint and her need for choice. Neither of them said anything more. There would be time for more later if the mountains and the miles and the men who hunted them allowed it. On the following evening, Colton found Silas alone at the edge of camp and said what needed saying. He did not build to it gradually. He did not wrap it in humor or deflection. He spoke the way men speak when the stakes are too high for anything but the plain truth. "You love her." Silas did not deny it. "It is complicated." No, it is simple. You love her. She loves you. I have watched it happen for weeks. I am not blind. Colton paused. His voice lost the last trace of its usual ease. I care about her too, a great deal, but I love my brother more. And I am not the kind of man who stands between two people who belong together. Colton, do not make it a big thing. I am a grown man. A bruised heart heals. A brother who is too stubborn to tell a woman the truth about how he feels because he is afraid of losing control of something for the first time in his life that I cannot forgive. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Colton Gray gripped Silas's shoulder the way men grip each other when words have run out and only the pressure of a hand can carry what remains and walked away. It was finished, cleanly, without drama or accusation or lingering resentment, the way brothers who truly love each other handle the hardest things. The next morning, the shadow became flesh. Nathaniel Fowler rode into camp openly approaching while the brothers were saddling their horses. He was lean, cold-eyed, moving with the measured deliberation of a man who had been carrying violence inside him for a very long time and had grown accustomed to its weight. Silas Callahan. His voice was flat, southern, the accent of a man who had fought on the losing side and gone west to find something other than defeat. Been looking for you a long time. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Fowler and every person he loved. His arms stayed at his sides. His hands were open. He would not draw first. He would not be the aggressor. Not again. Nathaniel, I hoped you had given up. A man does not give up on family. You should know that. Behind Silas, the camp had gone rigid. Colton's hand hovered near his holster. Beckett moved instinctively in front of Eliza. Emmett gripped his father's rifle with white-knuckled hands. Fowler's next words were addressed not to Silas, but to everyone. Your brother killed mine. Garrett Fowler. Shot him dead 7 years ago. The impact was seismic. Colton and Beckett turned to Silas with identical expressions of shock. 7 years. Their brother had been carrying this for 7 years and never told them. Silas spoke with the controlled precision of a man laying out facts in a courtroom. Your brother drew first. He was terrorizing the Henderson family, burned their barn, poisoned their well, threatened their children. I tried to resolve it without violence. He refused. Sheriff's opinion does not bring Garrett back. No, it does not. The standoff vibrated with potential violence. The morning air, still cool from the mountain night, felt suddenly thin, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was Eliza who broke it. She stepped around Beckett's protective stance and walked forward until she stood beside Silas. She was 5'3". She weighed perhaps 110 pounds. And in that moment, standing next to a man who towered over her by more than a foot, facing down a stranger with a gun, in a grievance, she looked like the most formidable person in the camp. Mr. Fowler, I understand your grief. I have lost people I loved, and the pain does not diminish with time. But what you are contemplating will not bring your brother back. It will only add another death to a tragedy that already has too many. Ma'am, this does not concern you. It concerns me because the man you are threatening is the man I intend to marry. If you shoot him, you will have to shoot me first, because I will not step aside. The words rang across the camp like a bell struck in an empty church. Public, absolute. Simultaneously a declaration of love and a tactical masterstroke, because Nathaniel Fowler, whatever darkness he carried, was not the kind of man who shot women. A silence stretched so long it seemed to bend time. Then Fowler's hand moved away from his weapon. This is not over, Callahan. It is for today, Silas replied. Fowler turned his horse and disappeared into the landscape as quickly as he had arrived. In the aftermath, the brothers collided. Colton grabbed Silas's arm. 7 years. You have been carrying this for 7 years, and you never told us. I was protecting you. By lying to us. By keeping a target off your backs. They argued fiercely, painfully, in the raw and ugly way that only family can argue, until Josiah's voice, hoarse but commanding, carried from the wagon where he lay. Enough, save it for when we are not stranded in open country with a man who wants your brother dead somewhere behind us. Fight later. Survive now. The old man's words cut through the anger like cold water on flame. Not because they resolved anything, but because they reminded every person present that survival was not a given, and that they could not afford the luxury of division. That evening, Eliza found Silas sitting alone away from the fire, staring at the vast, dark nothing of the plains. She sat beside him, their shoulders touched, and neither pulled away. "You meant what you said," he stated, not a question. "Every word. You barely know me. I know everything I need to know. I know you protect the people you love at the cost of yourself. I know you carry guilt you do not deserve. I know you are terrified right now, not of Fowler, but of letting anyone close enough to share the weight." His breath caught audibly. "Eliza, do not push me away with logic or selflessness. I have made my choice, Silas. I made it somewhere between the river crossing and the stampede and 100 cups of coffee with 2 sugars. I choose you, all of you, the silence, the stubbornness, the scars, everything." For a long time, the only sound was the wind moving through the grass and the distant low of cattle settling for the night. Then Silas reached out and took her hand. His massive calloused palm enveloped her small fingers with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that had spent a lifetime breaking earth and mending wire. He held on as if he was learning for the first time in his 33 years that some things are worth reaching for, even when reaching means risking everything. They sat together in the darkness, hand in hand, and the stars above the Colorado plains bore witness to two hearts finally surrendering to what they had both feared and wanted since the moment they met. 2 nights later, Josiah's fever spiked. Eliza felt the heat radiating from his skin before she touched him, a furnace burning beneath the surface, the body's desperate war against infection. His face was gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. The wound on his leg was swollen and red, the inflammation spreading upward with the relentless advance of something that did not care about courage or loyalty, or the fact that a 17-year-old boy was kneeling beside his father with tears running down his face. "He needs quinine," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the cold tear in her chest. "Carbolic acid, something to fight the infection. Without it," she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Silas stood in the wagon's lamplight, looking at the man who had been a father to him in every way that mattered, and felt something he had not felt since the day he stood over Garrett Fowler's body, the utter helplessness of a man confronting a situation that strength and will and stubbornness cannot fix. They were 100 miles from the nearest doctor. Sending a rider would cost days they did not have, and the herd could not wait. Then out of the darkness, the sound of a single horse approaching. Every hand reached for a weapon. Every eye strained against the night. Nathaniel Fowler rode into the firelight with his hands raised. "Do not shoot," he said. "I have medicine." He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, and pulled a leather kit from his saddlebag. Carbolic acid, clean bandages, quinine, the medical supplies of a man who had learned in the same terrible war that had shaped them all that wounds do not wait for doctors. Silas's rifle was still raised. "Why you I?" Fowler looked past him to the wagon where Josiah lay shaking, and Emmett knelt beside him, and something moved across his face that was larger and older than vengeance. Something that looked in the trembling firelight very much like recognition. "Because I have been that boy," Fowler said, his voice stripped of everything but the raw truth beneath. "Sitting beside my brother's bed, begging God to let him live. I came here to kill you, Callahan. I followed you from Ridgerest. I set that fire. I planned to pick you off on the trail." He paused. "But I cannot sit out there in the dark and listen to that boy cry and do nothing. I am not that far gone, not yet." Eliza did not wait for permission. She took the carbolic acid and went to work on Josiah's wound, cleaning it with a thoroughness that made the old man groan even through his delirium. Fowler guided her, his knowledge drawn from battlefield surgery, from the trenches and field hospitals, where the Confederacy's sons had learned to mend what the Union's sons had broken. They worked through the night. Silas stood guard, his rifle across his knees, watching the man who had tried to destroy them, now fighting to save the life of someone he had never met. The contradiction was so vast it defied comprehension, and yet it was happening right here by firelight, on the open prairie, because human beings are more complicated than the stories they tell about themselves. By dawn, Josiah's fever had broken. Emmett lay asleep with his head on his father's chest, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. And Nathaniel Fowler stood beside his horse, preparing to leave. "Fowler," Silas said. The man paused but did not turn. "Thank you, a single nod. I am heading south. California, maybe. Somewhere I can start being something other than a dead man's brother. He mounted his horse and rode into the morning light, and no one followed and no one tried to stop him. Eliza watched him go, and then she looked at Silas and saw that his eyes were bright in a way she had never seen before. Not many tears, just enough to catch the new sun. What you said to him that day, he said hoarsely, meaning her confrontation at the camp. About more death not bringing his brother back. You may have saved both our lives. She took his hand, held it, said nothing because nothing needed saying. The remaining days of the drove carried a different quality, lighter, more open. As if the crises they had survived the river, the fire, the broken bone, the enemy who chose mercy over vengeance, had burned away the pretenses and left only what was real. Josiah, stubborn as the mountains that had made him refuse to lie still. He commandeered the wagon seat and issued orders with the authority of a man who could not walk but could damn well still think. Herd is drifting east, he would call to Beckett. Watch that ravine on the left flank, he would warn Colton. And to Silas, with the particular bluntness that only a surrogate father can employ, stop looking at her and watch the cattle. There will be time for that when we are not trying to save your ranch. Emmett had changed. The boy who had ridden out of the Callahan ranch 3 weeks ago no longer existed. In his place was a young man who carried his father's responsibilities without complaint and performed them with a quiet competence that drew an approving nod from Josiah and a rare word of praise from Silas. He was becoming, Eliza thought, exactly what his father had raised him to be. And the knowledge that Josiah was alive to see it made the old man's eyes shine in a way that had nothing to do with fever. Around the campfire, stories were told. Josiah recounted how he had come to the Callahan Ranch 15 years ago, a broken man drinking himself to death, after losing his wife, found half frozen beside a mountain trail, by the elder Callahan who brought him home, fed him, gave him work, and never asked a single question about his past. Your father saved my life, he told the brothers, his weathered voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. Not through heroics or grand gestures. He saved it by giving me a purpose when I had lost mine. Beckett sketched them all by firelight, Silas's profile against the flames, Colton's easy sprawl, Eliza's face illuminated by the warm glow, Josiah's bandaged leg propped on a saddle, Emmett asleep against his father's shoulder. It was the finest work he had ever produced, and when Eliza saw it the next morning, she drew in a sharp breath. Beckett, this belongs in a gallery. It belongs where it is, he said softly, with family. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne on the 18th day, 4 days behind the schedule Eliza had drawn up on the kitchen table in what felt like another lifetime. The city appeared below them as they crested the final ridge, sprawling and loud and alive with the energy of commerce. The railhead dominated the eastern skyline. Cattle pens and auction houses and hotels lined the streets. After weeks of silence and starlight and the vast, empty beauty of the open range, it was like stepping into another world. We made it, Eliza said. She was dusty sunburned, thinner than when they had started and more alive than she had ever been. Was there any doubt, Colton asked, and his smile, though quieter than it used to be, was genuine. Silas looked at Eliza. She looked back. And between them passed something that did not require words, a shared understanding of what they had survived and what it meant, an acknowledgement that the two people who had ridden out of Ridgerest were not the same two people who had arrived in Cheyenne. They were better. They were harder. They were bound together by trials that had tested every weakness and rewarded every strength. And they were not finished yet. The herd was settled in a holding area outside the city. The wagon was pulled aside for repair, and Josiah, gray-faced but refusing to be carried, was loaded onto a borrowed stretcher and taken toward the nearest physician's office, with Emmett walking beside him and refusing to let go of his hand. Ahead lay the negotiation, the sale, the money that would save the ranch or condemn it. And somewhere between Boston and Cheyenne, a man named Edmund Graves, who had business with Eliza Whitmore that was not yet finished. But those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, on the outskirts of a frontier city with the smell of cattle and wood smoke in the air, and the first stars appearing above the Wyoming plains, Eliza sat beside Silas on the lowered tailgate of their battered supply wagon and allowed herself, for the first time since her father's death, to believe that the future might contain something other than survival. It might contain joy. Silas's hand found hers in the gathering dark. She laced her fingers through his, and together they watched the lights of Cheyenne flicker to life below them, each small flame a promise that the world, for all its cruelty, still had room for people the stubborn enough to fight for what they loved. Cheyenne waited, and Eliza Whitmore, who had left Boston with nothing and crossed a continent on faith, was ready. Cheyenne smelled of money and manure, of locomotive smoke and ambition, of whiskey and fresh-cut lumber, and the particular electric restlessness of a place where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sundown. After weeks in the vast silence of the open range, the noise alone was enough to make Eliza's head swim. Wagon wheels on packed dirt, the bellow of cattle in the stockyards, the clang of hammers from the railhead where crews worked around the clock to feed the insatiable appetite of the East for Western beef. Voices in a dozen accents calling prices and names and insults across the crowded streets. She stood on the boardwalk outside the Plainsman Hotel, wearing the one clean shirt she had saved for this occasion, her honey blonde hair pinned with a care that felt almost foreign after weeks of trail dust and wind. Beside her, Silas looked like exactly what he was, a man who had driven cattle 200 miles through fire and flood and the shadow of a man who wanted him dead, and who had arrived with every animal accounted for and every debt unpaid but not forgotten. Their first stop was the doctor. The physician who examined Josiah was a brisk, competent man named Hadley, who unwrapped the field splint with professional interest and spent several minutes probing the healing bone, while Josiah gripped the arms of his chair and said nothing, though his knuckles went white as chalk. "Who treated this in the field?" the doctor asked. "I did," Eliza said from the doorway, with guidance from someone who had experience with battlefield wounds. The doctor looked at her with the particular surprise of a man encountering competence where he did not expect it. "You saved his leg, possibly his life. The carbolic acid was applied correctly and in time. Another day without it, and the infection would have reached the bone." He turned to Josiah. "You will walk with a limp for the rest of your days, Mr. Crawford, but you will walk." Josiah nodded once, the gesture carrying the restrained satisfaction of a man who considered any outcome short of death to be acceptable. "I have been limping through life for 56 years, doctor." "What is one more reason?" Outside the office, Silas pulled Eliza aside. His expression held something she had not seen before, something unguarded and almost raw. "You saved him," he said. "On the trail, with the carbolic acid, you saved him." "Fowler saved him," Eliza corrected. "I just did what needed doing." Silas shook his head slowly. "You have been doing what needs doing since the day you arrived. I brought you to my ranch because I needed someone to keep books and organize supplies. What I got was something I did not know I needed and do not deserve." "You can let me decide what you deserve," she said quietly. He almost smiled. On Silas Callahan almost was a seismic event. The negotiation for the cattle was the next morning. Eliza had spent the previous evening in preparation, while the brothers settled the herd in a holding area outside the city, and Emmett stayed with Josiah at the hotel. She had walked through the cattlemen's district alone, visiting 3 separate buyers under the pretense of general inquiry. She asked innocent questions in the voice of a woman who did not quite understand the cattle business and would be so grateful for any guidance a knowledgeable gentleman might offer. She batted no eyelashes. She played no feminine cards. She simply presented herself as slightly less informed than she was, and the men she spoke with, mistaking modesty for ignorance, told her everything she needed to know about current prices, market conditions, supply forecasts, and the competitive dynamics between the major buyers. By the time she returned to the hotel, she had a complete picture of the market and a negotiating strategy that her father, rest his meticulous soul, would have approved. The meeting was with Wallace Garrett, one of the largest buyers for the eastern markets. His office at the Cattlemen's Exchange was paneled in dark wood and smelled of cigars and self-importance. He was a heavy-set man with shrewd eyes in the manner of someone accustomed to setting terms rather than negotiating them. He looked up when Eliza entered, followed by Silas. His gaze moved from the small woman in the practical clothes to the enormous man behind her, and made the calculation that most people made: she was the decoration, he was the decision-maker. "And you are?" Garrett asked, directing the question somewhere between them. "Eliza Whitmore, representing Callahan Ranch." Her voice carried the precise, unhurried cadence of a woman who had been trained to present figures to skeptical men. We have 112 head of prime Hereford Longhorn, cross-driven 200 miles from our mountain ranch and in excellent condition. I would like to discuss terms. Garrett's eyebrows climbed. He leaned back in his chair and offered his opening price with the casual confidence of a man who expected the number to end the conversation. $18 a head. Market is soft this season. The market is not soft, Eliza replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the composed certainty of someone holding better cards. Supply is down 14% from last year due to the hard winter. 3 major herds out of Texas failed to reach the railheads. Demand from the Chicago Packers has increased since the new refrigeration contracts were signed in April. You know this, Mr. Garrett, which is why $18 is not a serious offer but a test to see whether I have done my homework. She produced a handwritten analysis from her satchel. Market rates drawn from 3 competing buyers. Supply projections based on reported herd movements. Quality comparisons between the Callahan stock and the other herds currently available in Cheyenne. The document was thorough, precise, and presented with the quiet devastation of evidence that cannot be argued. $23 per head, she concluded. A fair price reflecting both market conditions and the exceptional quality of our animals. You are welcome to inspect them this afternoon. Garrett stared at the analysis, then at Eliza, then at Silas, who stood behind her with his arms crossed and his face revealing nothing, a wall of muscle and silence that served as a rather effective visual endorsement. Jacobson offered 22, Eliza added, naming Garrett's primary competitor. But I prefer to work with you, assuming we can agree on fair terms. It was a bluff, but not entirely. Colton had spoken with one of Jacobson's agents the previous day. The interest was real. The specific price was Eliza's invention. Garrett set down the analysis. 23, he said. Eliza smiled. It was a small smile, controlled and professional, but behind it was the fierce triumph of a woman who had just secured the future of the people she loved with nothing but numbers and nerve. Outside the office, Silas turned to her. Where did you learn to do that? My father was a bookkeeper who married a school teacher. I inherited stubbornness from both sides. Colton, who had been waiting on the boardwalk, caught the expression on his brother's face and grinned. I take it we are not bankrupt. 112 head at $23, Eliza reported. $2,576. The number settled over them like sunlight after a long storm. Colton sat down heavily on the nearest bench. Beckett closed his eyes. Emmett, who had come running from the hotel at Colton's signal, let out a whoop that startled a horse tied to the nearest rail, and Silas said nothing for a very long time. He stood on the boardwalk of Cheyenne, Wyoming territory in the summer of 1878, and he looked at Eliza Whitmore as if she were the first sunrise he had ever seen, as if every sunrise before this one had been merely a rehearsal for the moment when light finally meant something. The celebration that evening was the first unguarded happiness any of them had allowed themselves since the drive began. Josiah, propped in a chair at the hotel restaurant with his splinted leg extended, raised a glass of whiskey with the solemn formality of a man performing a sacrament. To Miss Eliza, he said, who proved that determination beats doubt every time. To all of us, Eliza insisted, looking around the table at the faces of the people who had become her family in the space of a few desperate weeks. Her gaze lingered on Silas, who was watching her with the expression that had become as familiar and as necessary to her as breathing. To all of us, Josiah amended, and to the old man who built the ranch that brought us together. He would have liked you, Miss Eliza. He would have liked you very much. It was the highest compliment Josiah Crawford had ever paid to any living person, and every man at the table knew it. The knock came later that night. Eliza was in her hotel room reviewing the sale documents one final time before the morning delivery to the stockyards, when the rap at her door sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Colton answered it. He had been sitting in the hallway, ostensibly reading a newspaper, actually standing guard, because Silas had asked him to, and because whatever friction existed between the brothers protecting Eliza was a principle on which all 3 Callahans were in absolute agreement. The man at the door was 55 years old, well-dressed in the manner of Eastern money that has learned to travel west without wrinkling, and his smile carried the particular warmth of a serpent basking on a sun-heated rock. I am looking for Miss Eliza Whitmore, he said. My name is Edmund Graves. Eliza heard the name through the open door, and felt the blood leave her face, the letter in the hidden pocket. The threat she had carried across 2,000 miles. The reason she had fled Boston, answered a stranger's advertisement, and hurled herself into the unknown. It had found her. It had always been going to find her. She understood that now. Colton, who did not know the name but recognized danger when it smiled at him, blocked the doorway with his body. She is not receiving visitors. I am an old friend of her father's. I have traveled a great distance to speak with her. Surely a brief conversation is not unreasonable. Eliza appeared behind Colton. Let him in. Eliza. Let him in, Colton. I have been running from this man for 6 months. It is time to stop running. Graves entered the room with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to occupying other people's spaces. He assessed Eliza with the quick efficiency of a predator, evaluating prey, noting the trail-worn clothes, the sunburned face, the calluses on her hands. Whatever he had expected to find at the end of his pursuit, it was not this. Miss Whitmore, you are not easy to find. That was the intention. He reached into his coat and produced a document, a promissory note bearing her father's signature. $2,000, payable to Edmund Graves on demand. The paper was real. The signature was genuine. The debt Eliza was certain was not. Your father's obligations survive him, I am afraid. The law is quite clear on the matter. I have come to arrange repayment. Silas appeared in the doorway. He had been summoned by Emmett, who had been posted as a runner between the rooms, and he entered the room with the slow, measured stride of a man who has assessed a situation and found it intolerable. His massive frame filled the doorframe, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mr. Graves, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that was more frightening than any shout. My name is Silas Callahan. Miss Whitmore is under the protection of my family. If you have a legitimate legal claim, you will present it to a lawyer. You will not press it in a hotel room. Graves looked at Silas. He saw the scarred hands, the controlled intensity, the absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect the woman standing behind him. And he recalculated, as men like Graves always recalculate, weighing risk against reward with the cold precision of a balance sheet. Of course, he said, his smile unchanged, but his eyes harder. I merely wish to discuss the matter civilly. I am staying at the Grand Hotel. Miss Whitmore, when you are ready to settle your father's affairs, you know where to find me. After he left, the room erupted. Colton paced. Beckett went immediately to Eliza's side. Emmett watched from the corner with eyes that had seen too much for 17 years. Silas turned to Eliza. Tell me everything. And she did. For the first time since she had boarded the train in Boston, Eliza told the whole truth. Graves had been her father's business partner. He had systematically embezzled from the company over a period of years, draining the accounts while maintaining a facade of friendship and shared enterprise. When her father discovered the theft, the partnership dissolved. Her father's health, already weakened by the stress and betrayal, collapsed. He died of tuberculosis 6 months ago, leaving Eliza with nothing but debts, some real and some fabricated, by the man who had ruined him. I answered your advertisement because I was desperate, she said, her voice breaking for the first time since the drive began. Not just for a home, to escape a man I believed destroyed my father. I should have told you this from the beginning. I am sorry. We all have secrets we are afraid to share, Silas replied, and the weight of his own hidden past gave the words a gravity that transcended comfort. What matters is that you shared it now, and we face it together. The next morning, while Silas and Colton supervised the cattle delivery to the stockyards, Eliza and Beckett went to the telegraph office. She sent 2 messages, one to her father's former attorney in Boston, requesting any documentation of the Graves partnership, and one to the business editor of the Boston Herald, whom her father had known socially. While waiting for responses, Beckett helped Eliza organize the personal papers she had carried from Boston. In a bundle of letters that Eliza had kept more for sentiment than purpose, Beckett noticed something she had overlooked. A small notebook bound in plain brown leather, filled with her father's precise handwriting. It was a shadow ledger, a complete, meticulous, coded record of every discrepancy in the partnership accounts, every diverted payment, every falsified entry, every dollar Graves had stolen, documented with the painstaking accuracy of a bookkeeper who knew he was building a case against a man who would destroy him for building it. Eliza held the notebook in her hands and wept. Not with grief, though grief was part of it. with recognition. Her father had known what Graves was doing. He had documented everything, and he had hidden the evidence among his personal papers, knowing that Eliza trained in his methods, taught to read ledgers the way other children read storybooks, would find it and understand. "He left this for me," she whispered. "He knew I would understand it." The telegraph responses arrived the following day. The attorney confirmed that the promissory note was disputed before her father's death and that the partnership dissolution was under legal review. The Herald editor revealed that Graves was currently under investigation by Boston authorities for fraud in two separate business dealings. He was not a grieving friend collecting a legitimate debt. He was a serial predator, and Eliza's father had been one of his victims. Armed with the shadow ledger and the telegraph confirmations, Eliza and Silas went to Graves at the Grand Hotel. The confrontation was brief. Eliza presented the evidence with the calm, methodical precision her father had taught her. Each entry in the shadow ledger corresponded to a fraudulent transaction. Each diverted payment was documented with dates, amounts, and account numbers. The telegraph confirmations provided corroboration from independent sources. The case was not airtight, but it was devastating enough to make prosecution not only possible but likely. "Here is what will happen, Mr. Graves," Eliza said. Her voice carried an authority that Silas had heard before in the church at Ridgerest and at the negotiating table with Wallace Garrett, but this time it was backed by something harder. Not anger, justice. "You will destroy that fraudulent promissory note. You will leave Cheyenne today. You will never contact me again. If you do this ledger along with the copies I have already sent to my father's attorney, and the Boston District Attorney will ensure that your next address is a prison cell." Graves stared at the notebook. He recognized the handwriting. He knew what it contained. And in that moment, the mask of urbane civility cracked, and what lay beneath was the face of a man who had underestimated his victim and overestimated his own invulnerability. "Your father," he said bitterly, "was a more dangerous man than he appeared." "So is his daughter," Silas observed from behind Eliza, his voice quiet and carrying the unmistakable implication that Eliza's father was not the only dangerous person in the room. Graves tore up the promissory note. He packed his bags. He left Cheyenne on the afternoon train, and he would not trouble Eliza Whitmore again. Walking back from the Grand Hotel, Eliza stopped in the middle of the street. Silas stopped beside her. She looked up at him with eyes that were red from crying and bright from victory and soft with something that she had been trying to name for weeks and was only now brave enough to call by its true name. "It is over," she said. "Graves, the debt, the running, all of it. Yes, I am free." "You were always free, Eliza. You just had to see it." She laughed. It was a sound that startled both of them, full of relief and exhaustion, and the giddy disbelief of a woman who has been carrying a weight so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. And then in the middle of a dusty street in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, with cattle lowing in the stockyards and the evening train whistling in the distance, Silas Callahan took her face in his massive hands with a tenderness that contradicted everything about his phone and his scars and his granite exterior, and he kissed her. It was brief, it was gentle, and it was the first time in his 33 years that Silas Callahan had initiated an act of pure and calculated, indefensible tenderness. When they parted, Eliza was smiling. "Was that a practical decision?" she teased softly. "The most impractical thing I have ever done," he replied, "and I intend to keep doing it." The return journey to Ridgerest took 6 days of easy travel. Without the herd to manage, they moved at a comfortable pace following the same route that had nearly broken them weeks before. The landscape that had been a crucible was now simply beautiful, the mountains and meadows and rivers passing beneath them like a benediction. Josiah rode in the wagon, his leg healing his opinions on every subject offered freely and received with the tolerant affection of a family accustomed to his particular brand of wisdom. Emmett drove the team with a quiet competence that made his father's eyes shine. Colton rode beside Beckett, and the two middle brothers spent the long hours talking about the future with an ease that suggested the crisis had sorted more than just the ranch's finances. And Silas and Eliza rode side by side, their horses close enough that their stirrups occasionally touched, talking about everything and nothing with the deep, unhurried intimacy of two people who have stopped being afraid of what they feel. He told her about his mother, a gentle woman who loved music and kept wildflowers on every surface of the house, Eliza told him about her mother's belief in education and independence. They discovered shared values beneath their different backgrounds: loyalty, honesty, the conviction that love is expressed through action rather than declaration. Your father, Eliza said on the fourth day as they rode through a meadow so thick with wildflowers the horses waded through color, the one who could not tell your mother he loved her until she was dying. What do you think he would say about us? Silas considered this for a long time. I think he would say, do not be like me. Do not wait until it is too late to say the things that matter. And what things matter, Silas? He looked at her with those amber eyes that she had learned to read as fluently as her father's ledgers. You already know. I want to hear you say it. He took a breath. A man who could face down a stampede and carry a killing secret for 7 years and ride 200 miles through danger without flinching, gathering his courage for the most terrifying act of his life, vulnerability. I love you, Eliza Whitmore. I did not intend to. I did not plan for it. I brought you to my ranch because I needed a bookkeeper and a housekeeper, and what I got was the person who makes every room she enters feel like the home I have been building for 15 years without knowing who it was for. Eliza reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. I love you too, Silas Callahan, and I choose you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because there is nowhere else I want to be. They arrived in Ridgerest on a golden August afternoon. Word of their return preceded them. Emmett, unable to contain his excitement, had ridden ahead. The town's reaction was precisely what Eliza expected: a complicated mixture of curiosity, grudging admiration, and in certain quarters dismay. Their first stop was the bank. Vernon Whitfield looked up from his desk as Eliza and Silas entered his office, and his face went the color of old ash. He had expected them to fail. Cornelius Pemberton had expected them to fail. The entire scheme depended on their failure, and here they stood, dusty and sunburned and very much not failing. Silas placed $500 in cash on the desk. Eliza placed the receipt from the Cheyenne cattle sale beside it. Our payment, Silas said, in full, on time, with interest calculated to the penny, Eliza added, producing a handwritten accounting that matched the bank's figures exactly. Whitfield stared at the money, then at the two people standing before him, and something shifted in his face, a tectonic movement of conscience that had been building for months beneath layers of fear and complicity. There is something you should know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The accelerated repayment. It was not a regional directive. It was Mayor Pemberton. He pressured me to reclassify your loan. He has been doing the same to other ranchers, anyone with land he wants. The admission cost Vernon Whitfield everything and nothing. It cost him Pemberton's protection. It cost him the moral compromise that had allowed him to sleep at night. And it cost him nothing of value because what he received in return was something he had not possessed in years: the ability to look at himself in a mirror without flinching. He provided documentation, letters, meeting notes, records of other affected families, enough to expose not just the scheme against the Callahans, but the systematic campaign of financial predation that Cornelius Pemberton had been waging against the entire valley. Silas took the documents to Reverend Ezekiel Whitaker and Dr. Leland Fletcher, two men whose integrity was beyond Pemberton's reach. A town meeting was called, and for the first time the full scope of the mayor's corruption was laid bare before the community he had been robbing. Pemberton tried to bluster his way through. He was a man accustomed to controlling rooms, controlling narratives, controlling the small levers of power that allow one person to bend a community to his will. But the evidence was overwhelming. 3 other ranching families stood and told their stories, their voices shaking with the combined weight of anger and relief. Miss Hargrove sat in the back row and watched her brother's empire crumble with an expression that moved by degrees from defiance to denial to something that might in time become shame. The vote to remove Pemberton from office was not close. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed into the evening light, Adelaide Fletcher found Eliza on the church steps and took her hands. This town owes you more than it will ever admit, she said. You came here as a stranger, and you saved not just one family, but all of us. I came here as a stranger, Eliza replied, squeezing the older woman's hands. I am leaving as a neighbor. That is enough. The wedding took place 2 weeks later on a September morning painted in the gold and crimson of Colorado autumn. It was held on the ranch, Eliza's choice, because this was the place that mattered, the land that had tested her, and the home that had accepted her, and she would not pledge her future anywhere else. Adelaide Fletcher arrived 2 days early to help with the dress. They sewed it together in the upstairs room that had been a mother's sewing room and was now irrevocably Eliza's, a simple white gown, modest and beautiful, made with fabric ordered from Denver and stitched with the careful attention of two women who understood that some garments carry more weight than their cloth. Leland was the same way when we married, Adelaide confided as they pinned the hem. I spent the first year convinced he did not love me because he never said the words. Then I realized he said them every time he rode 30 miles through a blizzard to deliver a baby so that I would not have to worry. Men like ours speak a different language, Eliza. Learn to hear it. I already have, Eliza said softly, thinking of coffee with 2 sugars and a porch step repaired in the dark and a blanket placed on a bed by hands that could bend iron but chose gentleness. Beckett took charge of the decorations with an enthusiasm that surprised his brothers. He gathered wildflowers from the mountain meadows, columbine, Indian paintbrush, mountain lupine. He arranged them along the porch and down the path and around the simple wooden arch that Emmett had built under Josiah's exacting supervision. And he produced a gift for Eliza that nearly undid her, a hand-drawn portrait of her parents rendered from her descriptions, capturing the love and partnership she had told him about during those long evenings on the trail. "So they can be here today," he said simply. Eliza held the drawing and pressed it against her heart and could not speak for several minutes. Josiah Crawford was asked to walk Eliza down the path in her father's absence. He resisted at first on grounds that he could barely walk at all. Then Emmett handed him a cane that the boy had carved himself from a piece of mountain ash, and the old man looked at it and looked at his son and said nothing, because there are moments when words are not simply inadequate, but irrelevant. The guests gathered in the yard, Adelaide and Leland Fletcher, Reverend Ezekiel Whitaker, Emmett standing tall in borrowed clothes, a handful of townspeople whose opinions had shifted in the weeks since the drive, and in the back barely noticed Vernon Whitfield, who had come not because he was invited, but because he needed to see with his own eyes that the people he had almost helped destroy were going to be all right. The 3 Callahan brothers stood at the front. Colton served as best man, his smile genuine and carrying only the faintest shadow of what might have been. Beckett stood beside him with his sketchbook tucked inside his jacket, already composing the scene in his mind. And Silas waited. He had scrubbed his boots until the leather shone. He had pressed his shirt with an iron he had never used before and would never use again. He had shaved with a steadiness that belied the condition of his nerves, which were, by his own later admission, worse than anything he had experienced during the stampede, the river crossing, or the confrontation with Nathaniel Fowler combined. When Eliza appeared at the end of the path, walking beside Josiah, who managed the distance with the grim determination of a man who would crawl if necessary, Silas Callahan's composure broke. Not dramatically, not obviously, but those who knew him saw it. The tremor in his jaw, the brightness in his amber eyes, the way his massive hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as if they could not decide whether to reach for her or hold themselves still. Josiah delivered Eliza to the altar and whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. "Your father would have approved, and your mother would have cried." "She is not the only one," Eliza whispered back. Reverend Whitaker kept the ceremony brief. He was a man who recognized that the 2 people standing before him had already made their vows in 100 unspoken ways in the language of shared labor and survived danger and the small, persistent acts of love that accumulate over time into something unbreakable. When it came time for Silas to speak, his voice was rough, with an emotion he had spent 33 years avoiding and 33 seconds surrendering to. "I am not a man of words," he said, and several people in the small gathering smiled because this was the most obvious truth ever spoken. "I cannot promise poetry or fine speeches, but I can promise this: every sunrise I will wake up and choose to be worthy of you. Every fence I mend, every field I plant, every wall I build will be for you and for whatever family we are blessed to make together. I did not know I was lonely until you arrived, Eliza. Now I cannot imagine a life without you in it." Eliza's vows were equally simple and equally devastating. "Silas, I came to this place expecting duty and found love. I came expecting one man and found a family. You have shown me that strength is not the absence of tenderness, that courage is not the absence of fear, And that home is not a place, but a person. You are my home, Silas Callahan. Today, tomorrow, and every day that follows. The kiss was brief. The cheer that followed it was not. It rose from the small gathering and rolled across the mountain valley like thunder, carrying with it the joy of people who have witnessed something true. That evening, after the guests had gone and the ranch had settled into the deep quiet of a mountain night, Silas and Eliza stood together on the porch. Their porch now, their home. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in colors that no artist, not even Beckett, could fully capture. The land stretched before them, the land that had nearly been lost and was now saved, the land that had tested them and found them worthy. Scared, Silas asked. It was the same question he had asked on the night before the cattle drive a lifetime ago. Not anymore, Eliza replied, and she meant it. He took her hand, she laced her fingers through his, and together they watched the last light fade over the mountains that had become their world. The door closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything had changed between them, and everything that mattered in the ranch, the family, the love remained exactly as it was. 3 years passed. The Callahan Ranch in the autumn of 1881 bore little resemblance to the struggling operation that Eliza Whitmore had arrived at on a dusty July afternoon 3 years before. The herd had doubled. A new barn stood beside the old one built by the brothers during a summer of back-breaking labor that Colton still claimed had permanently damaged his sense of humor. The house had been expanded, a nursery added to the upper floor for 2-year-old Wyatt Callahan, a dark-haired boy with his father's amber eyes and his mother's cornflower blue gaze, who had inherited Silas's quiet intensity and Eliza's stubborn refusal to accept any situation he found unsatisfactory. Josiah Crawford, now formally titled foreman, rather than merely serving as one, ran the daily operations, with the authority of a man who had been doing this work since before most of his crew was born. He walked with a limp that he wore like a badge of honor, the physical proof of the drive that had saved the ranch, and he carried the cane Emmett had carved for him everywhere, though whether he actually needed it or simply liked having something to gesture with when issuing orders was a subject of ongoing family debate. Emmett Crawford, 20 years old and engaged to a girl from the neighboring Pearson Ranch, worked alongside his father with the steady competence of a young man who had found his place in the world. He no longer carried the gangly uncertainty of the boy who had ridden out on the cattle drive. That boy had been replaced somewhere between the river crossing and the stampede in the night. His father's fever broke by someone harder and more certain, shaped by crisis into the kind of man his father had always known he could be. Colton Callahan had surprised everyone, including himself. A year ago on a business trip to Denver, he had met Lenora Whitaker, the Reverend's niece, a dark-haired schoolteacher with sharp eyes and a wit that cut through his charm like sunlight through fog. She had seen him, not the easy smile or the practiced conversation. Him, the real Colton. The one who cared too deeply and deflected too often and had once loved a woman he could not have and had let her go with a grace that cost him more than anyone would ever know. Lenora had looked at all of that and said, "I see you, and I am not going anywhere." They married 6 months ago. Lenora now taught at the new Ridgerest schoolhouse, which the Callahans had helped fund, because Eliza believed that a community without education was a community without a future, and because she intended to make sure that the next generation of Ridgerest children had opportunities that distance and poverty would otherwise deny them. Beckett Callahan had found his path. His frontier sketches, the drawings he had filled notebooks with for years without showing anyone except Eliza, were now appearing in Eastern magazines and newspapers. A publisher in New York had written to express interest in a collection. Beckett was considering the trip east, the first of the brothers to venture beyond the territory, carrying with him Eliza's encouragement and a portfolio of work that captured the beauty and brutality of the frontier with an honesty that city readers found both exotic and deeply moving. The ranch itself had become a model operation recognized throughout the region for the quality of its stock and the progressive efficiency of its management. Buyers from as far away as Kansas City sought Callahan cattle. Other ranchers visited to study the bookkeeping system that Eliza had designed, which tracked every animal, every expense, every projection with the rigor of a Boston counting house, adapted to the realities of mountain ranching. Mrs. Abigail Hargrove had undergone what the more charitable members of Ridgerest called a conversion and what the less charitable called an extended bout of eating crow. The transformation had begun the previous winter when a storm destroyed several homes and businesses in town, including the Hargrove residents. Eliza had organized the community response coordinating supplies shelter and rebuilding efforts with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. She had personally delivered blankets and food to Abigail Hargrove's temporary quarters in the church basement, and the older woman, confronted with kindness from the person she had most consistently disparaged, had found her supply of disapproval finally exhausted. They were not friends. They might never be friends. But when Abigail Hargrove spoke of Eliza Callahan now, the word she used most often was capable, and from Abigail Hargrove, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. On this particular morning, in the golden light of an October day that smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of a mountain autumn, Eliza sat on the porch with Wyatt in her lap. The boy was pointing at things and naming them with the imperious confidence of a 2-year-old who believes that the act of naming confers ownership. Horse, he declared, pointing at the corral. Yes, darling. Tree. Yes. Daddy. Eliza looked up. Silas was crossing the yard from the corral where he had been working with a young Palomino colt, and his face broke into the smile that he still reserved exclusively for his wife and son. It was the smile that Eliza had spent 3 years learning to earn, and a lifetime intending to keep, a rare and radiant thing that transformed the severe planes of his face into something that looked in the right light, very much like joy. He reached the porch and lifted Wyatt to his shoulders with the easy strength of a man who could handle fragile things with extraordinary gentleness. Then he settled beside Eliza, his arm around her waist, and together they looked out over the land. The mountains stood where they had always stood, patient, impermanent, and indifferent to the small human dramas played out in their shadow. The cattle grazed in the autumn pasture. Josiah's voice carried from the barn, issuing instructions to Emmett, with the comfortable authority of a man who had finally, after years of wandering and loss, and the slow, patient work of building a new life from the wreckage of the old, found exactly where he belonged. "Penny for your thoughts," Silas said. It had become a ritual between them, this question asked at quiet moments when the day's work was done and the world had shrunk to the size of a porch and 2 people and the impossible luck of having found each other. Eliza smiled up at him. "I was thinking about that day in the general store, when everyone was saying I was wild and unfit. And I said you would match me just fine," he finished. The memory was clear despite all that had happened since, sharp-edged and bright, the hinge point of 2 lives swinging open. "Smartest thing you ever said." "Second smartest, after I do." Their laughter mingled in the autumn air. Wyatt demanded attention. Josiah called that it was time to check the north pasture fence. Beckett appeared on the porch with his sketchbook, already framing the scene the family gathered in the golden light. The mountains behind them, the home they had built together, standing solid and warm against the vast and different beauty of the world. Eliza leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. He pressed his lips to her hair, and the feeling that moved through her in that moment was not happiness, though happiness was part of it. It was something larger. Something that encompassed the grief of losing her parents and the terror of the journey west and the desperate gamble of the cattle drive and the miracle of finding at the end of it all, not just survival, but love. It was the feeling of a woman who had been told she was not enough, who had been pursued by predators and judged by strangers and tested by a land that did not forgive weakness, and who had answered every challenge with the same quiet, unbreakable determination that her mother had taught her and her father had modeled, and Silas Callahan had recognized the moment he saw it. Whitmore women do not break. We bend and then we straighten. Eliza Callahan had straightened, and the life she had built with her own hands and her own heart and the help of 3 mountain men who had seen her worth before she fully understood it herself was proof that sometimes the people the world calls wild and unfit are simply waiting for the place where they belong. She had found hers. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.